Welcome to the Save the Frogs World Summit, Day 2, 2022. I am very pleased to introduce Chris Berry, longtime Save the Frogs supporter, volunteer, and even before Save the Frogs has been working to protect amphibians and the environment, especially in Santa Cruz, California. Chris is a wealth of knowledge, especially as relates to how governments can be and are involved in amphibian conservation. All right, Chris.
Thanks, Dr. Krieger. It's great to be here at the World Summit again. I'm hoping I can come up with a new story today, or at least an iteration of an old story that will be informative to folks, and hopefully there's some lessons that folks can take to their own neck of the planet. I'm mostly going to talk about California red-legged frogs today, although not so much as a biologist, but more as a policy wonk, thinking about how us bureaucrats can make the planet a little bit more friendly for frogs. And in our neck of the woods, that's mostly California red-legged frogs. So I'm the watershed manager for the City of Santa Cruz. I work in the water department. And I'll share a little bit more about why I'm involved in frogs in the next few slides. I do have a ton of slides. I'm going to break every rule of PowerPoint. So I'm going to race through. If there are questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer them. But with that, I think I'm going to keep my eyes on the clock because I know Dr. Krieger likes to run a tight ship. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. And with that, I'll get into it. So let's see if I can, the inevitable technical glitches here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to do a little introduction, species background, recovery priorities, recovery implementation, and ways to get involved. I know everyone wants to know how can they make things better and make the planet more hospitable for frogs. So I do want to focus there. We're here in Santa Cruz County on the central coast of California, about 75 miles south of San Francisco. Although Santa Cruz County has a lot more in common with north of San Francisco than south, where the Redwood Belt starts here, just north of the Pajaro River. The Pajaro River divides Monterey and Santa Cruz counties. So anyway, so I'm the watershed manager. We focus mostly on drinking water source protection. As a drinking water provider who gets most of our water from surface water, meaning creeks and lakes, drinking water source protection is a big deal for us. And that has a long history going back, well, in the United States, back to the city, New York City, and protection of the Catskills in the 1800s, and perhaps even before that. But globally, that's an old concept that was really put into federal law during the Clinton administration. So it's kind of neat to go back in history and look at how different cultures protected their watersheds and their drinking water sources, and think about how we can leverage that for protection of the environment in general. So I also do environmental regulatory compliance, and I deal with specifically with California red-legged frog because they are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Of course, we deal with other regulations as well. I'm trying to run a water utility for over 100,000 people in the midst of watersheds that are sometimes protected federal lands or have listed species. There are a lot of regulations to deal with. And also we're in the coastal zone. So there's the California Coastal Act that we also deal with in our operations. So I'm going to say this over and over again. I want to create this understanding that watershed protection is beneficial for not just for frogs, but for drinking water, for listed fish species, be they coho. We're at the southern extent of the coho salmon range, and coho are on the verge of extinction. So a lot of our work is driven by coho recovery needs. But this overarching theme of watershed protection is something I want to get across. And that has economic benefits as well. We have a huge tourist economy here. A lot of people come here to enjoy our open space and our beaches. When they go to the beach, they want to see clean beaches. They don't want to see trash on the beaches that washes out of our watersheds. So I think it's a false reality that we have to pit the environment versus economic health. I mean, those things can go hand in hand. And I should give a shout out to my boss here. He did in his previous position, did this study on healthy lands and healthy economies. And we can debate and get into the weeds all we want, but the overarching theme again is that we can have healthy economies and healthy watersheds, and I think that's really important. For those of you that are less familiar with the concept of watersheds, there's a link down there at EPA, which has a really good description of watersheds and their benefits. And there's even a watershed academy, which a long time ago when I was starting out, I went through the watershed academy, and that was really helpful. So a little background on red-legged frogs. There are state amphibian, thanks to Save the Frogs and some students down south. They are federally listed. What else can I say about red-legged frogs? I don't want to read my slides because that's one rule of PowerPoint I hate to break. We're sort of in the middle of their range. They do extend down into Southern California and formally into Baja. Largest native frog in the West. One thing that I'll point out is they're often not that red. A lot of folks that are new to red-legged frogs are out in the tromping around looking for some bright red tropical looking frog, and that's really not the case, generally speaking. They can have some orange and yellowish tinge to their hind legs and their bellies, but they're very rarely red all over like you might see with some other species. The dorsolateral folds are really good ID diagnostic, and that lack of the large tympanum, like the bullfrogs have that massive ear that is pretty telling, and I always describe bullfrogs as being a little bit more rounded. You might see in this picture as well as a couple coming how different they are. We find them in typical, and I say typical because we think of these ponds like you see on the top as, hey, that's a frog pond. We're actually rescuing juvenile coho in that pond, which juvenile coho in a frog pond is a bit of a conundrum because coho like very cold water temperatures and shady conditions, and obviously frogs generally don't. So that was an interesting situation where we were actually pulling a seine to collect coho, but we were catching red-legged frog larvae in the process, which created an interesting field day. But we also find red-legged frogs foraging and dispersing in these shady creek settings, like you'll see in the picture below. Food sources fairly typical, not as vocal as American bullfrogs, and I'm hoping before my half hour's up, I'll get to hear Dr. Krieger give his red-legged frog or bullfrog call. He's sort of famous for that, as you may have already heard. But here's some pictures that will illustrate the differences between the frogs that we most commonly see here in Santa Cruz. The Sierra tree frog on the top, a melanistic juvenile bullfrog in the middle, and then a California red-legged frog on the bottom. And I know that oftentimes we get these melanistic juvenile bullfrogs in our creeks, and a lot of times people think they're red-legged frogs that are dispersing, myself included. When I was a younger person, I came across a juvenile bullfrog that was very dark and reddish, probably picked up tannins from tan oaks and redwood trees that are common along our streams, and they can pick up that coloration that, if you're not super familiar with the species, can be a little bit confusing. So here's some life stage figures, really very informative, from Norm Scott, who's a pioneer in the field here and knows more about red-legged frogs than probably anybody else on the planet. I won't pretend to be the red-legged frog expert here that he is, so I'm just going to show this for background information. Our range is reduced to 30% of what it formerly was. You've probably heard this story before about how they ranged up into the Sierra foothills across the Central Valley, but they were eaten extensively by gold miners and workers in the gold mines and along the railroads and in the forestry business long ago. The famous jumping frog of Calaveras County was thought to be the California red-legged frog. So it really is appropriate that they are the state amphibian, and it's a shame that their range has been reduced so much, but our goal is to change that, right? So here's the current range. You can see my cursor. They would have extended across the Central Valley, south of LA, down into Baja, and probably down into the Southern Sierra too. So recovery priorities. This is not so different from most of the listed species that folks deal with. I guess I want to focus on sort of the policy and land use side of things. Um, Protecting populations, that's sort of a no-brainer, as is most of this. Again, many of these actions have benefits for drinking water, but also for other listed species, be they coho or steelhead or other amphibian species. So there are co-benefits to implementing these recovery plans. And outreach, we do a ton of outreach in my program, both for drinking water source protection purposes, but just general environmental protection purposes too. Um, Open space preservation, again, everyone likes open space, right? So whether you're a mountain biker or a hiker or a birder or what have you, we like our open spaces, and I have a slide further on that'll demonstrate how much Santa Cruz likes their open space, but how important that land use policy side of things is as well for recovering these species. Let's see. So here we are. Most of my work is in the South San Francisco Bay core area. These are the core areas as defined by the Red-Legged Frog Recovery Plan. Um, we don't have a lot of red-legged frogs in the Santa Cruz County core area. For some reason, the San Lorenzo watershed and the adjacent Arana watershed just don't have a lot of good red-legged frog habitat. One thing that's notable about those watersheds is they were the earliest developed watersheds in the county. The San Lorenzo watershed in particular was really one of the most industrialized watersheds south of San Francisco in the 1800s, with clear-cut logging, mining, extensive railroad development, houses along every stream corridor. So there really is a long history of human activity there that has likely altered the landscape to the extent that the habitat is really needs a lot of work to come back. Whereas on the what we call the North Coast in the South San Francisco Bay core area, we have a lot more intact habitat. So um, it's funny, folks on the North Coast think red-legged frogs are everywhere, and why are they even listed? But obviously, if they're reduced to 30% of their range statewide, that's a problem. So this is some of our North Coast habitat. This is Laguna Creek Lagoon on top. This is a pipeline crossing on Laguna Creek in a more of a stream setting where it's very shady, but because of the pipeline, there's actually you'll see a beam of sun coming down, and on any given day, I could virtually guarantee you there'll be at least one red-legged frog sitting in that beam of sun right there underneath the pipeline. So um, obviously that's kind of interesting, but it's also challenging as a water utility because every time our maintenance folks want to go out and work on a pipeline, I have to talk to them about, hey, there's that pipeline crossing, and we need to be careful of red-legged frogs there. So, and then just an air view of the area we're talking about. You can see this is the pond right here at Coast Area State Beaches, formerly known as lagunas by the surfers. This is that same pond full of red-legged frogs. Majors Creek adjacent to that, also full of frogs. Um, so recovery implementation, what we're doing here in Santa Cruz, there really is a lot going on. Not all of it is specifically focused on red-legged frogs, but all of which has tangential, if not direct, benefits to red-legged frogs. Again, that watershed protection focus, sort of overarching, but the city is engaged in habitat conservation planning, drinking water source protection, regional conservation investment strategy, and here I am breaking my own rules about reading PowerPoint slides. You can see that, but one of the hottest things going on right now is the Sustainable Santa Cruz County Plan. That's an update to the county's general plan, which is the sort of the overarching document for the planning department in Santa Cruz County, which basically dictates how development will happen in the county, but also what open spaces will be protected, what are our natural resource protection goals, everything from sensitive species to view sheds. It really is an all-encompassing document and much broader than the typical environment that we think of, whether it be streams or creeks or special status species. It's a very broad document, but also has potential to be very meaningful in terms of amphibian conservation. So there's a link down there if you want to get involved. There's actually an environmental impact report coming out on this plan in the next few months. So that's a neat way for people to get involved. And I'll get a little bit more into that later in the presentation here. So again, watershed protection. There's a nice little graphic we use for our education purposes, but here's the San Lorenzo watershed again, that area I talked about not having a lot of good red-legged frog habitat, but the North Coast in that South San Francisco core area has quite a lot of good habitat. And here's the Laguna Creek again. I think you can tell just by the lack of bubbles popping out on the North Coast that if there's a lack of bubbles and a lack of human disturbance, then it's probably better for frogs, right? So I want to illustrate that watershed perspective. As much as our environmental regulations have improved since the late 60s and early 70s. Ironically, under the Nixon administration, we had most of the landmark environmental regulations developed. Today, it seems like the GOP is a little bit less focused on that. And without getting too political, I just want to illustrate how important it is to be involved in policymaking. So it took a big fight to get the Clean Water Act established, and that's been really important, not only for drinking water, but also for protection of habitat. Those of us that are more technically inclined find it startling at best to think that we're debating the limits of the Clean Water Act in terms of hydrologic connectivity and how watersheds function. But we do have political discussions about that. And of course, different interests would like to limit that as much as possible. But here's a very stark example of where policy is not well aligned with the technical reality. So it's sort of my lifelong goal to have technical people be more involved in policymaking and to have policymakers be more technically literate. So I think to give a shout out to Save the Frogs and Dr. Krieger, I really appreciate the opportunity to get up here and preach and stand on my soapbox here and get that message across. This just came out last week, I think, about the half U.S. waters are too polluted to swim or fish. And to me, it's like, wow, is that a 1965 headline? No, that's 2022, which tells me the fight is never over. We have to continue to press for protection of our natural resources. One of those ways we can do that is to reduce our water footprint. There are various reasons why people might choose a certain diet or a certain lifestyle, but if you're focused on water and protection of habitat, there's real linkage with the way you live your life. So I won't preach too much on that. But it's interesting to me to see that, wow, tea is actually significantly less water consumptive than coffee. I guess that makes sense. And I see Dr. Krieger's drinking some tea there, so kudos to you. For the vegetarians in the house, it's kind of a bummer that cheese is so water intensive, but there you have it. Okay, that said, habitat conservation planning. We've just finished a habitat conservation plan, and I say finished in quotes because it was a long effort to develop the plan, but it actually has a 30-year timeline. So finished is not really there's really no finishing that for many years, which it's good. It's a long-term plan. It's a long-term commitment the city has made toward amphibian conservation as well as several other species. So this is required under federal law for activities that might result in impacts on special status species. And red-legged frogs being present in many of our drinking water source watersheds mean that we obviously have issues with trying to, for instance, maintain a pipeline if we have a problem there and we have red-legged frogs right below it in that little sunbeam. So it's a plan that basically says how we're going to conduct our pipeline maintenance or our water diversions, but also contribute toward recovery of the species. So it involves funding assurances for 30 years, for instance. Really, the biggest thing that we've done in this plan is to improve the flows in the streams that we work in, which is it's a monumental task for a population of 100,000 people. And we hear about these water battles all the time. It's very rare that we make positive progress on these things. So it was a great relief after 20 years of working on this plan to actually have it be approved last year. And it really has changed the city's operations massively and changed the way that we manage water in a drought, for instance, which we're facing a second year of drought right now. But I'm proud to say we're still providing those flows. I know Dr. Krieger said keep the graphs to a minimum. to all the presenters, but this one is very telling. Before we improved our in-stream flows, we were drying up Laguna Creek every summer, which is obviously not good for frogs or for coho, which are also found there. Even in 2021, which was a critically dry water year, we had pretty decent inflows in Laguna Creek. So, of course, the city wasn't taking a drop out of Laguna Creek last year and will not this year either. But that's the commitment we've made to protecting the environment and changing the way that we think about managing water, not so much as a consumptive water user, but as a manager of water resources and the environment in general. So our mission has changed a little bit in the last few years to consider broader stewardship of water resources rather than just being your typical consumptive user of natural resources. So, and every picture tells a story. Again, top picture is Laguna, that pond that I showed previously. Back in the old days, when we used to divert every drop of water and you'd get a puddle at the bottom of the watershed, that was pretty horrible habitat, and likely didn't provide much habitat at all other than for tidewater goby. And then in better times, with inflows that are creating that beautiful wetland there in the back, we had coho that year, I believe. So even in the midst of a drought, we've got pretty good habitat values by virtue of the city changing its practices. And in all fairness, those practices were initiated in the 1800s. Santa Cruz is an old town, and a lot of its infrastructure was developed in the 1800s. And along with that, the operational practices were developed back at that time. So the North Coast water sources are gravity fed and clean. So you got to figure a town that's just starting out, they're thinking, well, clean gravity fed water, that sounds good. We don't have to spend a lot of energy pumping that or treating that. So it's sort of a natural that the city grew up around those antiquated practices, but it's nice to say that we've turned a corner on that now. So real quick, we're a leader in the state with our residential water use. I won't belabor this point too much, but LA needs to get with the program. All of our water is locally sourced, unlike LA. So I'm sure this is going to be getting a lot of headlines this summer with the Governor Newsom just gave a statewide edict about water conservation, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of headlines around that. Drinking water source protection, just belaboring that point again about how protecting the watersheds for listed species is also beneficial for drinking water quality. And this is another effort that we engage in under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Again, that was prompted by the Clinton administration back in the 90s. Another regional planning effort, the Regional Conservation Investment Strategy, basically setting up conservation goals more broadly for the environment, including for red-legged frog. Red-legged frogs are not a core or a focal species for this plan, but they are, because of other species like Santa Cruz long-toed salamander and coho salmon, there are co-benefits from focusing on conservation needs for those species that will benefit red-legged frog. And here's our land use slide. We do have a lot of open space, but we also have a lot of urban areas and a lot of private land holdings. So how do we use this land use matrix to better work toward our conservation goals? Obviously, it's easier to work on public land, but there's a lot of private land too. So how do we leverage the private land to support what's happening on the public land? And I think that the regional conservation investment strategy and some other, and that sustainability process will help us figure out how to make those two land uses work better together. Just wanted to show some of the linkage between habitats. So if you look at, for instance, that Aptos core here, we have linkage with the area. Actually, thankfully, some property I manage around Loch Lomond. These are two really big areas of open space. But we have a highway in the middle, which is obviously a problem. Thankfully, the Land Trust and Caltrans are working on a wildlife corridor under the highway now, but there's a lot of private land in here that if we're thinking about conservation planning, it's like, okay, well, how do we get connectivity and linkage between these big blocks of open space? How do we get from Loch Lomond to the North Coast? And that's something that will benefit not just mountain lions, but that'll benefit amphibians, red-legged frogs having quite a good ability to travel overland. So again, there's co-benefits for multiple species. So also want to mention the RCD, the Resource Conservation District, is developing an In-Lieu fee program to try to get it developing conservation banks. So people that need permits, who have mitigation needs, can buy into those banks. And that's something I'm looking to see if we can leverage for getting private landowners involved who may have code compliance issues. Also using permit mitigation needs to leverage other activities. Like we need to clean up homeless camps a lot. So that's we've used that in the past as a mitigation for permits in the past, and I think there's more opportunities there. And of course, invasive species management. You may have heard a lot about that, but that's something I worked with Dr. Krieger quite a bit in 2012. And I'm proud to say that Santa Cruz County is looking to potentially leverage that process to work on other invasive species now. So we do tons of education, including today's event, which I'm happy to be in again. 2,000 plus students served. We work with all stakeholders, whether they be students or adults or what have you. We have this cool watershed sign program that our former colleague Christina Finstad developed. Earth Day, Snapshot Day, name it. There's lots of events, lots of good stuff going on, and working with the media is critical too, I've got to say. So that's something that think about your messaging and how you're developing partnerships with your media when you're talking about amphibian conservation. So ways to get involved. I'm not going to read through these. You could do a screenshot right now or go to the Save the Frogs website at the end and you'll see this recorded and you can look at these. One thing that's come up a lot lately is mosquito abatement, which obviously that's a thing like drinking water. Mosquito abatement's a necessary thing for public health, but has potential implications for listed species. So whether it's putting mosquito fish out to control mosquitoes or applying pesticides in our wetlands, that's an activity that is super important, but also needs to be done very deliberately and in an informed manner in terms of amphibian conservation and drinking water quality. So that's just something I wanted to put on the radar. And two very important time-sensitive things you can do now. Advocate for better bullfrog policies. There's a hearing coming up at the State Fish and Game Commission in May, where you can weigh in on some of the work that Dr. Krieger and I have been involved in for a long time. And then the Clean Water Act has, as recently as yesterday, has come under attack. Most recently at the Supreme Court, the Biden administration is hoping to strengthen the Clean Water Act, but my guess is that's going to be a massive fight. So if folks don't reach out to their legislators and let them know that that's important to them, it likely will not get the attention that it needs. So here's a few more resources. Really highly recommend you go to these links, and that's it. I think I have 1 minute left, so if there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks a lot, Chris. There is a question, and it comes from Margot. I saw a fascinating TED Talk about water harvesting, which has been adopted in some large cities. Is that something that you do in your water management?
Without knowing a little bit more about that, I really don't know how to answer that question, but we divert from streams in the wintertime. In fact, we're tailoring our drinking water treatment process to be able to better manage water when it's available, that being in the winter in this Mediterranean climate, and put that water into the ground for the dry periods. So we're planning in the future to put winter water into the ground to recover our groundwater basins so that we can use less of the surface water in the dry time so that we can benefit the environment and have better supply reliability. And that's something that's responsive to climate change needs as well, with our changing hydrologic regimes here in Santa Cruz and throughout California and the West. That's something that we need to do, not just for protection of amphibians, but for the reliability of our water supply.
All right, thanks. You can turn your video back on. I didn't mean to turn that off just now. I was actually trying to unshare your screen. All right, so we are out of time. Margot was referring to collecting rainwater, it appears. She's got a link there. So anyone with questions for Chris, go ahead, chat them in. Chris, feel free to respond via chat to anything that comes in or to address Margot's question.
And feel free to email me too. My email's right here. And thanks for having me today. Keep up the good work.
Chris. Feel free to put in your email and any relevant links in there. I added in a couple links. All right, thank you so much for your decade plus of amphibian assistance with Save the Frogs.
Thank you.